I was 17 years old. I'd spent 12 years of my life acquiring the vocabulary, you might say, of classical piano, starting with the ABC song, or Mississippi Hot Dog, as we called it in Suzuki. Mississippi Hot Dog, Mississippi Hot Dog, Mississippi Hot. When I was 4 or 5 years old, but continuing pretty seriously in that until in high school I was studying with a teacher at the New England Conservatory of Music. David DeVoe was his name, a very fine pianist and a very dedicated teacher who I disappointed in all kinds of ways. But the day I'll always remember with David was the day I disappointed him in the deepest way, I think. He had assigned me a Beethoven Sonata, one of the late sonatas, the ones that almost start to sound like jazz. And I had worked very diligently on it. And David had very high expectations. Mr. DeVoe, I called him, of course. Mr. DeVoe had very high expectations, and I had worked really hard to get this thing technically right. And I came in to play it for him for the first time, and sat down at the piano at the beginning of the lesson after a few warm-ups, and sort of set off into it and nailed it, I thought. All the difficult runs, all the complex left-right coordination, it really happened in as best a way as my little 17-year-old fingers could make it happen. And at the end of my run-through of it, at least in my memory, this was many years ago, so maybe I'm improving this story for your benefit, but not too much. I remember he didn't say anything at all, and I do remember he was just slightly trembling. And after a very awkward silence, he said, "You played that technically very well, but you have no idea what that piece is about." And he said, "I actually don't ever want to hear you play that piece again." He said, "At least not until you're, say, 30 years old." I remember the number 30 because it seemed impossibly far away. He said, "When Beethoven wrote this piece, he was deaf. He knew he would never hear another note of music. He was dying. He knew he had very little time left to live. And he put into this piece, with all of its technical difficulty and brilliance, he put into it all of that suffering, all of those unfulfilled longings, all of that pain. And he said, you don't understand the pain." He said, "Until you understand the pain, you cannot play this piece. Come back when you're 30. And I think that was the end of that one lesson. And we picked up the next week. We never talked about it again. And of course, what was happening that I could not possibly understand at that time was that Mr. DeVoe, he was over 30, and he was in his own journey of pain. And it was just unbearable to him to hear something that spoke to his pain so deeply played by someone who didn't even imagine what it was. What does this world call forth from us? What does it call for from us? I want to talk just for these few minutes about excellence, because what this world deserves is excellence. But excellence is not always what we think it is. It doesn't always mean what we think it means. We think of excellence in terms of achievement, having acquired mastery of some domain. And many of us, there's many different pathways that we've taken in this room, but many of us, you don't really come to a conference like this, I think, unless you've tried to develop skill. You've tried to learn some particular field, perhaps. Maybe it's architecture, maybe it's medicine, maybe it's mathematics. I met an actuary here. There's an actuary in the room who can tell you the probability that the Carrington event will happen. There's incredible work that it takes to just develop skill enough to join a particular discipline and begin to contribute in the way that these amazing spheres of culture can to the flourishing of the world and the restoration of the image. But excellence is not, I think, the same thing as mere skill or achievement. It requires skill, So if we're going to be image bearers and image restorers, and if we're going to make the most of today, that is all of our contingent reality, we're going to have to work as hard as we are capable of to develop skill. But that's, I'm thinking, ingredient 1 out of 4 of what makes for real excellence. I think excellence is actually skill plus patience plus risk plus suffering. Skill plus patience plus risk plus suffering. So excellence requires patience. Excellence does not come quickly because the first basic level of excellence is dissatisfaction with what's easy. In any field, now I know music best having been trained as a musician, I'm also a writer. And I know that the words, as a writer, the words that come to my mind most quickly are the easy words. They're the cliched words. They're the words that have already been said a lot, and often because they're true. But my job as a writer is to be patient enough to not just go with the easy word. My job as a musician is to be patient enough not just to go with the easy expression. When we encounter something that we think of as sentimental, what is sentimental? One of my mentors defined it in this wonderful way as unearned emotion. Sentimentality is, it's like those, nowadays sometimes commercials are 15 seconds, and sometimes in 15 seconds, really good advertisers can just sort of push your buttons in just the right way, at least if you're American, that you start to tear up, and you're like, oh, it's so easy, right? But what is it to be unsentimental? It's to push past cliche. It's to figure out what it would take to really do justice to whatever reality you're depicting in your art. It requires a long time, most of which of that time you're dissatisfied. It's not done, it's not ready. And the mark in a way of amateurs is they think it's ready when it's not ready. Are we willing to invest ourselves in whatever domain is our contingent place? Invest ourselves over a long period of dissatisfaction to get to the point where we are building what we do on patient practice rather than rushed performance. This has got to be the most countercultural possible theme. I mean, we live in the most impatient time in history because we're able to be impatient in a way that people were never able to be impatient before. And to have our impatience kind of satisfied and satiated. So you used to have to wait in lines without a glowing rectangle to accompany you. Sorry, queues, I guess it is. You used to have to stand there waiting for something to happen, and you just had to be there. This is inconceivable to us now. We all know what to do in those moments of, boredom and waiting. Pick this up. It's got something flattering to show you. It's got something to say to you. We live in an incredibly impatient era, and we are impatient for our own impact. In fact, the verb impact is a very impatient word. I don't know if people use it over here, but in the US, people are constantly saying to me, I really want to, as a Christian, I really want to impact the culture. And I say to them 2 things. I say, first of all, it is not a verb. Stop that. It's not a verb. Impact is not a verb. That makes me very uncomfortable. But then I try to interrogate, what kind of word is this? Impact the culture. The only, so then I say, well, where in popular culture do we see impact? And I think of these movies, it's been a while since there was one, but I'm sure there's one coming, about a comet, impacting the earth, right? It's it's a scene of destruction. And, and then what's the whole point of the movie? It's the cultures avoid impact. We send Bruce Willis or someone up there to divert the asteroid or the comet before it impacts our culture. The worst thing you can say to a culture is, we're here to impact you. That culture will organize to deflect the impacts. And even if that weren't enough, it's this model of just sort of instant change when the only change that you can bring about instantly is destruction. You can blow up a building in a moment. You cannot build a building in a moment. The only changes in culture that happen quickly, so I'm like, gosh, if you want to impact culture, I know how to impact culture. 21 men, 4 planes, 1 morning. You can impact culture. But can you create? Can you do something that will last? That requires patience. Are we willing to have the patience that excellence requires? Then, excellence requires risk. What we consistently admire in human beings is when they are willing to go to the very edge of their ability. Whatever level of ability they've developed, whatever level of skill they have, they're willing to go to the very edge of that and push it just to the absolute limit of what they could possibly plausibly do. This is why we find sport so compelling, because it pits one very skilled athlete or one very skilled team against another, and that competition puts both of them at the very edge. I mean, once you've acquired certain level of skill, say in basketball, I mean, you can sink free throws from the line over and over when no one's watching. It's what happens under the pressure of competition in the arena, as Christian said right before lunch, that we see people actually pushing to the edge of their ability. And this is where excellence is actually formed, is at the edge. But many of us, actually what we want to do is acquire just enough skill to reach a certain level where we will have a nice safe job and a salary and not keep pushing it. But excellence requires continually doubling down. Whatever you've already achieved, whatever you're already able to do, now turn around and do that in an even harder context, on something even more challenging, against opponents that are even more fierce and capable themselves. But the deepest thing excellence requires is suffering, and this is what Mr. DeVoe was so impatient with, in a way, unwilling to bear, rightly unwilling to bear. Because what we really admire in the most transformative human beings, and that's true whether it's our Nims's dad or whether it's any hero that's ever caught your attention, is their willingness to actually go to the pain. And I think this has two dimensions. I think the first is simply the unbought suffering that is in every one of our stories. Everyone here, I mean, partly what's so moving about a poem like that, a performance like that, is not all of us were bullied perhaps directly, but every one of us has been excluded at some time. Every one of us has experienced loss. Every one of us carries grief. And rather than running away from that, excellence actually builds on it. But there's another deeper level, I think. It's not just the unbought suffering, but it's actually sacrifice, which I think is willing suffering. Willingly entering into suffering that I would not have had to enter into. But when I do, all that skill, all that patience, all those risks I've taken are somehow transfigured into something genuinely transformative. And I just feel like this is what we witnessed. 3 people in a row here on this stage, Elizabeth, then Nims, then Christian. All people of obviously great innate talent who had developed it to the level of skill, but that's not why we applauded the way we did for each of them. It's because they'd taken that and they had their own innate suffering, the suffering of being great with child when you're about to go on air and not a lot of room in your stomach for what's in it. Like, that's just suffering, that's unbought, right? There you are. But letting it actually be part of the story. And then sacrifice, having the kinds of abilities and positions that Christian has had, but making the choice to cross that 4-lane road and go into that red light district. That's what's compelling. And of course it's compelling because it's the way of Jesus. This is the way of Jesus. He was super talented as a 12-year-old. He could go into the temple and ask lots of great questions and kind of take over. Very precocious young man. Not good at obeying his parents, apparently, at least at that moment. It was 18 more years before Jesus began his public ministry. At age 12, he was already confounding the sort of religious teachers of his day. And for 18 more years, until he was 30 years old, he kept apprenticing with his father, kept just developing who he was. Patience. And then when he began his ministry, the first thing he does after this big Holy Spirit moment is go out and fast in the desert for 40 days. Risk. His astonishing ability to confront every moment as if it were new, to confront every person with something new. He never, I think part of why we have so many versions of the parables is I don't think Jesus ever told the same story twice. We public speakers are very tempted when we find a joke that works, we're like, ooh, that one works. I'm using that next time. I don't think Jesus ever did that. He never responded to people in the way they expected because he was always taking a risk. And of course, most fundamentally, he was steering his course toward conflict, toward confrontation with the powers of his day. And that led, of course, to the one who in some ways might have had no unbought suffering in his blessed existence in the bond of love of the Father with the Spirit, made the ultimate sacrifice. I am so encouraged by what's happening here today, because I feel like it represents a kind of maturation of a cultural renewal vision. There's one version of cultural renewal that just talks about cultural presence. We need Christians present in culture. And that's true. But it sort of implies that if we just had some Christians kind of scattered through culture, things would be better. Then there's a little more ambitious form, which is for cultural influence. Well, what if we had Christians in positions of cultural power? Then they might be able to get some stuff done. But what we are actually here for is cultural transformation. And cultural transformation happens when people are willing not just to be present, not just to be influential, but take all of that presence and influence among the most vulnerable, among the most powerful, and transfigure it by a willingness to suffer and sacrifice. I am so encouraged by it. I've used up my 17 minutes. That's what I've got. Go forth, be patient, risk, suffer, and something transformational will happen in the world around you. Thank you.